An unknown assailant walked into a retail store and fired 3 shots, killing the owner. Police had suspects, but all had alibis. Forensic scientists found more than a crime perpetrated in broad daylight. Hidden in the shadows was a killer. Autumn is a particularly pretty time in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. Landscape photographers and local artists usually found their way here to the Gray Fox Gallery. The owner, Jennifer Myers, was a well-known picture framer.
Just a wonderful woman, a wonderful mother, a wonderful wife, and a good friend to a lot of people.
Managing a retail shop isn't easy. 1 year earlier, Jennifer was robbed in the store at gunpoint. Since then, her husband Steve stopped in every afternoon on his way home from work at the local factory. Most afternoon visits were uneventful, but October 20th, 1997 was different.
You're carrying 911.
My wife's been shot.
Your wife's been shot?
Yeah, at Gray Fox Gallery in Spring Grove. Hurry.
Okay, sir, listen to me, okay? Do you know who shot her?
No, I don't.
Okay, where at on her body is she shot
In
at?
the face.
Okay, is she breathing? Sir, is she breathing?
No.
When police arrived, Jennifer was dead on the floor behind the counter. She had been shot 3 times. Several workers nearby said they heard popping noises a few hours earlier around 1 p.m. No one thought they were gunfire. Several witnesses saw a man with long black hair running from the shopping center sometime around 1 p.m.
This was someone that went in there with the sole intent to kill the victim. There was no struggle. A fight didn't precipitate this homicide. A robbery didn't precipitate this.
No money was missing from the cash register or Jennifer's purse.
When something like this happens, people feel as though their world has somewhat been changed and their sense of security is gone. Because if something like this can happen in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania, it can happen anywhere.
This brazen attack in a busy retail area at midday told police that the killer was willing to risk everything to kill Jennifer Myers.
It's somebody who definitely wanted her dead, that had a problem with her, and excluding robbery as being a motive, that's what you have to start looking at. Who wanted Jennifer Myers dead?
A ballistic examination identified the murder weapon as either a .357 or a .38 caliber revolver.
In Pennsylvania, there's a database as far as registered handguns. So we began to look at that, and we found that Stephen Myers did have a .357 that he owned.
Steve Myers willingly turned over the pistol for forensic analysis, but he didn't resemble the man seen running near the shop earlier in the day. Witnesses said they heard popping sounds, which police suspected were gunfire, near the Gray Fox picture frame shop around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Approximately 2 hours later, Steve Myers discovered his wife Jennifer shot to death on the floor of the store. Another witness saw a man running from the area, wearing light blue jeans and a blue plaid flannel shirt.
We believe that the shooter came in the store, used a blitz-style attack on her, walking right towards her, firing the first shot and striking her in the shoulder area, and then firing a second shot, striking her in the abdomen. The last shot was to the face.
Ballistic experts examined the bullet fragments recovered from the victim and concluded the killer used a .38 or .357 caliber revolver. The victim's husband, Steve, owned a .357 revolver. When the bullets from the crime scene were compared to those test-fired from Steve Myers' revolver, analysts concluded they were not a match. Police also confirmed that Steve Myers was at work when the murder took place.
He didn't need an alibi, but as far as him being at work, that just was one more piece that fit in that he was not involved in this killing whatsoever.
Police had another promising lead. Jennifer's murder took place just one day before she was scheduled to testify against 40-year-old Kevin Dowling, the man Jennifer claimed had robbed her at gunpoint a year earlier.
Okay, well now we have perhaps a motive for someone to want to have this woman dead so that she was incapable of testifying.
Kevin Dowling had the opportunity to commit the murder since he was free on bail that day. However, when questioned by police, Dowling said he had an alibi. He was fishing on a boat in Muddy Run Lake, a story confirmed by his wife.
Mrs. Dowling was very cooperative. She truly believed that her husband was not involved in this homicide whatsoever, and therefore was very helpful in proving her husband's innocence.
Dowling also had evidence to support his alibi. He said he made a home video of his fishing trip that day. His wife willingly turned the video over to police.
As I said, here we are at Muddy Run Lake.
Because I wanted to help prove him innocent, that he did not do this. So I was more than happy to help them, and it was sort of like a slap in the face for them. Haha, he did not do it.
If this is truly a tape of him fishing, it's an airtight alibi. I want to secure it as evidence so that there's no further question.
The first thing police noticed was that the videotape was recorded with the date and time of day the footage was shot.
Pretty quiet, nice and peaceful out here.
The tape showed Dowling fishing in the middle of the lake from 10:46 in the morning until 4 p.m. on the day of Jennifer Myers' murder. Muddy Run Lake was a 45-minute drive away from Jennifer's store. Dowling also had store receipts for fish bait, food, and the boat rental. But something about the videotape looked odd.
He's trying to get something on tape of him fishing, but this is clearly not someone who's interested in catching any of the fish.
Kevin Dowling's family confirmed the tape was made on October 20th, the day of the murder.
In fact, that evening when he came home and my girls were home, and after dinner, we all sat around and watched the tape with him together.
On the tape, Kevin spoke to his children about his impending robbery trial. He also expressed his hope that if convicted, the children would not misbehave while he was imprisoned.
I gotta face what's ahead. I mean, I'm not responsible for what happened, but no one seems to want to help me, and I don't know what to do. My main concern is what's gonna happen to Mommy and all you kids.
He's accounting for almost everything he did that day, which in itself began to strike me as kind of odd that he has these receipts, and the day seemed too perfect as far as use the word alibi.
Police wondered if Dowling had somehow doctored the videotape, and if he had, could forensic science prove it? Kevin Dowling insisted he did not kill Jennifer Myers, despite the fact that she was scheduled to testify against him in an upcoming robbery trial. Dowling also had an alibi, claiming he was fishing at the time of the murder, and he offered this time and date stamp videotape as evidence.
There's some big fish on his fish finder. Just wish I knew how to get him to hit.
The tape contains scenes shot from 10 in the morning until after 4 p.m. Jennifer's murder took place around 1 p.m. and her store was only 45 minutes away from the lake. Dowling's videotape gave him an airtight alibi. But police were still suspicious. Although Dowling shot scenes throughout the day, the entire running time of the tape was only 12 minutes.
He talked several times in the tape about catching fish, yet you never saw any fish on the tape, which again struck me odd that if you were catching fish, you'd want to show them on your videotape.
Something else about the tape bothered Mowry. Kevin Dowling repeatedly glanced at his wristwatch.
Which struck me kind of odd if he was on a casual day of fishing, why he was so concerned about the time of day.
In some parts of the tape, Dowling's watch faced the camera. Investigators isolated and enlarged clips of the watch. The timepiece was too blurry to read. Mowry asked scientists at the Federal Bureau of Investigation to try digital enhancement, but the tape quality was too poor for the process to work. Determining the time when Dowling shot the video was critical, since police were well aware that the time and date stamp can be manipulated.
The sun was out periodically throughout the tape and was casting very good shadowing. By determining shadowing positioning, can we work backwards and calculate the time of day using the sun, its position in the sky?
Detectives posed the question to NASA scientists at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. Surprisingly, NASA identified a local astrophysicist to help them.
The guy that could probably do this was right in our own backyard, and that would be Dr. Robert Boyle at Dickinson College.
Dr. Robert Boyle is an associate professor of physics and astronomy. When he first saw the tape, he wasn't optimistic.
My heart just dropped because this was clearly not going to be a cut and dried case of, oh, there's shadows, you use them like sundials, you can tell the time. Because here was a picture where the camera was on a moving boat.
As the Earth rotates, the position of the sun changes, creating different shadows. When using the sun to tell time, two characteristics are observed: the sun's height overhead, or altitude, and its direction along the horizon, or azimuth.
The north point being 0 degrees, azimuth. The east point being 90 degrees, south point being 180 degrees, the west point 270 degrees.
Boyle said he needed more than just the videotape to conduct a study. He needed specific scientific information.
He would need some measurements of the boat. He would need the measurements of Kevin Dowling. He would need the measurements of the hat that Kevin had worn in the video.
But the most crucial piece of information Dr. Boyle needed was the magnetic north compass heading of the boat when the videotape was shot. To find out, police took the same boat onto Muddy Run Lake and identified its exact location by matching the landscape shown on the tape. Then, they identified the heading of the boat with a compass.
Out of the 8 frames that Professor Boyle had given us, we believed that we had matched 7 of the frames, and we used a degree of plus or minus 5 degrees as far as our degree of inaccuracy.
Next, using an artist's model, a light bulb, and a protractor, Dr. Boyle calculated the sun's azimuth, or direction, based on the shadows. The model represented Kevin Dowling. The light bulb, the sun. Dr. Boyle adjusted the light to produce the same shadows that were in the video. The protractor identified the sun's position based on the angle between the model and the light.
I essentially measured the angle between the direction of the camera and the direction of the sun, which is being mimicked by a light bulb.
Dr. Boyle used the Voyager 2 computer program, which identified the sun's exact position in 15-minute increments on the day of the murder. When he compared the exact position of the sun to the shadows on the video, Dr. Boyle discovered that the times stamped on some of the scenes were bogus.
Late afternoon timestamps could very well have been correct. There was a whole bunch of times in the middle that just were inconsistent with the astronomical data.
For example, in this scene, the background analysis shows that Dowling is facing north. It's stamped 11:24 in the morning. But you can see that the sun is clearly positioned to Dowling's left, which is west.
It's just so nice being out in the sun.
At 11:24, the sun would be in the east. Dr. Boyle estimates this scene was shot closer to 3 p.m.
Kevin Dowling now had the opportunity to commit this crime because he was not on Muddy Run Lake at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
And he also had a motive. But prosecutors needed more than shadows on videotape to get a murder conviction. When police confronted Kevin Dowling with the scientific evidence that his time and date stamp videotape was a forgery, Dowling confessed, not to Jennifer Myers' murder, but to deception. He now said that after a few hours of fishing, he went to a nearby strip club and altered the times on the videotape so that his wife wouldn't find out.
I don't need to point out the strangeness of that theory. First of all, why did you videotape yourself at all? Why didn't you just say, I decided I didn't want to videotape myself? And of course, his wife would have never been the wiser.
And the videotape revealed something else. Dowling was wearing clothes similar to the man witnesses saw running from Jennifer Myers' store.
I did not want to believe that my husband, the father of my children, could do something like this to another human being.
Police found the clothes Dowling was wearing on the fishing trip in his home. They sent them to A.J. Skip Schwobel, an internationally recognized expert in forensic gunshot residue. When a pistol is fired, the firing pin ignites the elements in the projectile, which then turns into gas.
The gases solidify into tiny particles, which are then deposited on the hands, clothing, and the immediate proximity of the discharge.
To test clothing for gunshot residue, Schwobel first used an adhesive to extract any microscopic particles. The particles were placed in a scanning electron microscope, which subjected them to extreme magnification and provided an elemental analysis. An electron beam bombarded the sample, causing the elements within to emit characteristic X-rays.
The characteristic X-rays show up on the video screen as peaks or pulses at different energy levels. Each energy level is assigned an element.
Tests revealed gunshot residue on the left side of each of Kevin Dowling's garments. This was significant since Dowling was left-handed.
We found that every item had, to some extent, some gunshot residue present.
Prosecutors say Kevin Dowling carefully planned to eliminate Jennifer Myers to prevent her from testifying against him in his robbery trial. On the day of the murder, Dowling went fishing on Muddy Run Lake and used his video camera till 11:45.
A little ways off, we'll be back in a little while.
He then went ashore, hid the boat in some bushes, and made the 45-minute trip into town. Wearing a wig as a disguise, Dowling entered Jennifer's store around 1 p.m. and fired 3 shots. The gunpowder residue embedded deep into his shirt fibers, invisible to the naked eye, but perfectly clear to forensic scientists. Dowling was back in his boat on the lake sometime around 2 p.m. When he reset the time on his video camera to 11:24, he never realized that he was a human sundial. His videotape told the story of deceit, not innocence.
I would like to kick his ass. He has no remorse at all. Then you wonder how sick this man really is when he has no remorse over what he's done. And that is very scary.
Despite the forensic evidence, Kevin Dowling insisted he was innocent. But he was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. His wife, Joanne, says she knew nothing of her husband's secret life and considers the death sentence too lenient.
I truly hate Kevin Dowling for everything he stands for, the person he is, what he did to people. I hate him more than I can even explain.
Well, you can't ever forget the infamous fishing tape, because how ridiculous is it to think that he would get away with something like that? I mean, there's technology today that's going to determine that this tape has been doctored.
It's one thing to have a motive to kill, it's another thing to actually prove that someone did it. And the forensics were able to give us the proof necessary.
Considering they never found the murder weapon, it's amazing what they can do nowadays. And without it, a lot of people would go free.
It's ironic, of course, we often talk about criminals hiding in the shadows, don't we? In this case, the shadows were actually revealing.
At one time, tourists in South Florida were a favorite target for criminals. Hundreds of visitors were robbed, some were assaulted, and 8 were murdered. It was an out-of-town journalist who made an unexpected journey from tourist to victim to advocate. In September of 1993, Uwe Wilhelm Rockebrand and his wife flew from Germany to Florida to spend their honeymoon. They rented a car for the short trip to their hotel.
The 2 German tourists were less than 5 minutes from the airport, just time enough to read safety precautions in a visitor's guide when they became the newest victims.
A van pulled behind them and rammed their car. The couple knew this wasn't an accident, but a ploy robbers use to get drivers to stop their cars.
They call it bump and rob, but the Rockabrands did what they were supposed to do and did not stop. Then the gunman pulled alongside and fired a single shot.
33-year-old Uwe Wilhelm was killed instantly. His 27-year-old bride, Catherine, was unharmed. By the end of the year, there were 8 tourist murders in South Florida. Hundreds more were robbed and many more seriously injured. Tourists were easy targets.
You can't change people's behavior. The lost tourists, looking at street signs, the holding up of maps, the camera bags, the luggage in the back seat. You know, it's not too hard to identify a tourist, especially around the airport.
And they have what criminals want: cameras, jewelry, video equipment, laptop computers, and they usually carry plenty of cash. Helga Lust covered these tourists' crimes as a journalist for German television.
I was working on a piece that was focused on the rash of crime that had taken place in the United States, specifically tourist-directed crime in Florida. And during the course of that piece, we talked about safety tips for German tourists that would be traveling to the United States.
Helga and her mother had scheduled their own Florida vacation before the crime spree started.
We decided to keep our plans of flying into Miami and then going on to the Florida Keys just for 4 days. Very brief stay, but particularly because I had just done this piece about safety tips and felt that my awareness was, pretty strong at that point.
Their vacation was relaxing and uneventful. Their return to the airport was not. They got lost looking for the airport rental car area. Helga drove onto a side street to turn around. She soon realized someone was following her. The man reached through the window, put the car into park, disconnected the horn, and assaulted the two.
My mother said, "Take whatever you want, but please don't hurt us." The passenger from their vehicle said, "Shut up, bitch, we're going to kill you." Both of the perpetrators were taking turns, beating me through my window, and every punch that I took weakened me.
The attackers tried desperately to grab the car keys.
I was able to get in a good couple of blows myself.
Somehow, Helga got the car into gear and drove away. To try to stop her, the attacker bit her arm.
I hit the driver from their car with the front of our car.
After a short distance, the man was forced to let go.
I had tremendous injuries to my head, my neck, my back, dislocated jaw, lost the feeling in my left side of my face, which I've never regained. And the bite wound was very painful.
The bite wound was deep. It went through the muscle.
Even animals will do what he did, the way he did it. Even animals don't do that. There's no need for that. To punch somebody, almost killing, paralyzing her, and then biting her and destroying her life. There's no need for that at all.
Helga described the attackers as young men, approximately 25 years old. They were driving a large, dark-colored car with tinted windows.
Most crimes happen and take place in less than 2 minutes. It's a hit, it's a theft, it's an assault, and it happens in a matter of just seconds.
So a positive identification of a suspect might be difficult. With no other witnesses or leads, police hoped Helga's car would contain the forensic evidence they needed. In 1993, 24-year-old Helga Lust barely escaped with her life after a harrowing encounter with two men who attempted to overpower her. Two veteran detectives, Bassam Fidel and Laura Lefebvre, with the Hialeah, Florida robbery squad, were assigned to the case.
And this particular robbery happened about 10 blocks north of the airport into Hialeah, into a mixed residential commercial neighborhood.
That neighborhood surrounds Lejeune Road, the only exit or entrance to the airport. Here, criminals often lie in wait for their victims.
It's the main artery. It's easy to hide, it's easy to follow. One way in and one way out of Miami International Airport.
They're hunters. They're hunting for robbery victims. It could have been your family. It could have been anybody in the community.
I'm sure as they followed her and they tailed her and targeted her, the discussion was how were they going to do it and when were they going to do it, in what manner.
At the time, rental cars were easily identified with stickers of the rental company and special license plates beginning with the letter Y or Z. Despite the increase in tourist crimes, South Florida's overall crime rate was less than the previous year. Nevertheless, the press coverage had an impact.
Miami was being hit with tourist robbery cases almost on a daily basis. This was a city that they viewed as a violent city, and they had no interest in coming back here.
European governments discouraged travel to Florida, and hotel reservations dropped by 25%. Ending the crime spree was difficult. Victims were often unwilling to return to Florida for court hearings and trials. This kept criminals on the streets. Most of the crimes were bump and rob, leaving behind little forensic evidence. But Helga's robbery had been unusually violent.
She had a bite mark located on her upper arm, and it was rather clear. I have a sexual battery background and know that they were developing bite mark comparison techniques. And the state-of-the-art place to process her was the photo lab at the medical examiner's office.
She was very sharp to immediately address that before the victim left or before the victim sought treatment, perhaps sutures or other medical treatment which can damage or alter the bite marks on the victim's arm.
Helga agreed to have a forensic photographer take pictures of the wound.
It's not enough just to take a photograph. It has to be measured properly, it has to be put into perspective, and it has to be documented properly.
It's important to get it done as quickly as you can. Things change very rapidly. Skin tends to discolor, bruising tends to set in.
In every picture, forensic protocol requires the use of a ruler to provide scale.
It's an L ruler. It has 3 circles on it that allows us to make sure that our camera is perpendicular to our subject, and that will also give us a sense of scale. So we take the flash and we hold it off to an angle where we can emphasize the surface texture of the skin.
And forensic photographers take pictures under many different light sources: conventional light, ultraviolet, infrared, and fluorescent. These show detail and texture not revealed by light in the visible spectrum.
Many times there's something there that you can't see with the naked eye.
Afterwards, investigators examined the rental car, hoping to find fingerprints.
But unfortunately, the weather was against us. Processing the outside of the vehicle was impossible.
The car was wet because Helga had driven through a thunderstorm on the way to the airport. The interior material was textured, which yielded no usable prints. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and no suspects. Helga and her mother left Miami not knowing whether the crime would ever be solved. And maybe it wouldn't have been had the perpetrator not left behind a piece of forensic evidence. Three weeks after Helga Luce's assault, she was asked to return to Florida to look through stacks of mugshots. She didn't see her attacker. Then the detective showed her a photo array of 6 suspects.
Helga looked at the lineup, and then she would look at each picture carefully. When she got to his picture, to Stanley Cornett's picture, and you could see an immediate reaction in her, physically an immediate reaction.
When I saw the defendant's face, it was a very, very weird mix of emotions. One of joy, because I found him, and one of complete terror, because it was the first time I had seen that face since it was locked on my arm, biting through the muscle.
24-year-old Stanley Cornett was a factory worker with a long criminal history. Since the tourist attacks happened in different jurisdictions near the airport, police formed a task force to exchange information. That's how LaFave first learned about Stanley Cornett. He was arrested a few days after Helga's attack for a nearly identical crime. He allegedly stopped an elderly man in a rental car and robbed him at gunpoint, but he picked on the wrong man. The victim's son was a Miami policeman who lived just across the street.
He called for his son, and he came running out of the house. Well, struggle ensued, and the victim tried to hold back the robber while he was calling for his son. And the robber at that time bit him in the upper arm.
The The similarities in the crimes were striking. But despite the identification, Cornett denied he assaulted Helga Lust.
I had tried a number of these cases previously, and the issue was always whether the identification was enough to pass muster with a jury, especially on a case where all you have is a single ID, in a robbery case where it took no longer than 20, 30 seconds.
So investigators wanted to know if there was any way to tell whether Cornett was the man who bit Helga's arm. To find out, police went to the same forensic expert who matched a bite wound to the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy.
From a bite mark, if it's a good one, you can actually get a dental profile of the suspect. For instance, an outline of what his teeth look like, if there's a gap or crooked teeth or whatever.
That profile can exclude a suspect or increase the likelihood that he made the bite mark. Dr. Souveron had the photos of Helga's bite wound, but he needed Cornett's dental impression for comparison. Cornett refused to cooperate.
You're not going to touch me, basically is what he said.
Just basically, you know, you're not getting anything out of my mouth. Except maybe the swear words.
They left empty-handed, but returned later with a court order specifying the use of force if necessary.
At which time he reiterated that he didn't want to cooperate. He wasn't going to open his mouth. And Dr. Souveron very casually brought out what's called a jaw jack for opening the jaws of cadavers that are in full rigor mortis.
You can put it in the jaw and you ratchet on this thing and it'll open it'll break your jaw if you try and resist hard enough.
When Stanley was shown the jaw jack, Stanley decided he wanted to cooperate and supply us with dental impressions. And so we obtained our dental impressions from Stanley Cornett.
From those impressions, Dr. Souveron made these plaster models, which allowed him to duplicate the bite patterns.
Test bites are made either in wax or in styrofoam to be able to analyze the patterns that these teeth are going to leave.
For further evaluation, the biting edges of the plaster teeth are blackened and the pattern copied onto a clear acetate for easy comparison with the photographs. Odontologists use a number of different techniques because there's no way to accurately estimate the elasticity of the victim's skin.
The teeth have variables, the skin has variables, and when this lady was bitten, she didn't just sit there and let this man, you know, bite her as hard as he could. We're showing this is a dynamic bite with movement going on, and teeth numbers 24 and 25 made the marks that these arrows pointed to, and then as the bite moved, the 26th tooth made that mark.
There is no such thing as a bite impression match. All experts can say is whether a bite wound is consistent with a person's teeth. Even if they are, it's still not 100% certain. But with the model, wax impression, acetates, and precision photographs, Dr. Souveron zeroed in on 3 lower teeth in the bite mark, which were slightly crooked and overlapping. And there was a deep mark made by an upper tooth. Even to untrained eyes, it looked like Cornett's teeth caused the bite wound in the photographs. Dr. Souveron was confident in his assessment.
His teeth were consistent with that bite, and there was nothing there that could exclude him.
Stanley Cornett was charged with attempted robbery and aggravated battery. But Cornett said he was innocent and that he had an alibi. A jury would have to decide which side they believed, the alibi or the bite impression evidence.
The ironic situation of having done a news piece about safety tips and then going to Florida and becoming part of the crime statistics. Even when you think you have all the tools at your disposal to keep yourself safe, if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, anything can happen.
As the trial approached for the brutal assault of Helga Lust, Stanley Cornett claimed he had an alibi, that he had been at work at the time of the crime. His work record showed that he was indeed at work that day. But Cornett's co-worker said he didn't always punch the time clock when leaving for a break, and he worked just 10 minutes away from where Helga was attacked.
His supervisor remembers that day in particular and remembered he left and never came back. He was soon after let go out of that job because of that. So that melted that alibi.
It's incredible that an individual would punch a time card, go to work like we all do in the morning, and he would leave during his break and go commit a violent crime against a tourist. But that's precisely what Stanley Cornett did.
Through various legal tactics, Cornett kept delaying his trial.
If my victim doesn't want to cooperate, then I have no case. And that's what these criminals count on. That's why they target the tourists. And in this case, they picked the wrong tourist. And Stanley Cornett was relying on wearing Helga Luce down to the point where she just gave up. He underestimated Helga Luce. She wasn't going to wear down. She came back for every trial date, every appointment she flew back for.
At the trial, Helga again identified Cornett as the man who attacked her.
Facing Stanley Cornett in court was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Through all of my testimony, the defendant had a smirk on his face. So I tried really hard not to focus on him and to focus on the prosecutor and the jury and the judge and the people that were there to embrace justice.
The clarity of the bite impression photographs taken by a qualified forensic photographer alongside the cast of Cornett's teeth were what ultimately convinced the jury. Stanley Cornett was found guilty of attempted robbery and aggravated battery. Because he was a repeat offender, he was sentenced to life in prison.
I tell the detectives, if you have a bite mark case, you don't tell the defendant that you have a bite, because they certainly can alter their teeth. It happened to me 2 weeks ago, where the defendant, when I saw him, had all of his upper and lower front teeth pulled while he was in prison. He told me he had a toothache, and they pulled his teeth.
As a prosecutor at the time, if it was somewhat new to me, imagine how new it was to a jury. They had certainly never heard of anything remotely similar to bite mark evidence.
The bite mark evidence, I think, sealed this case. It put the final nail in Stanley Cornett's coffin as far as the jury is concerned, I think. It was our strongest piece of evidence.
Of identifiable license plates. After her ordeal, Helga formed an advocacy group for victims of crime called Witness Justice.
She can meet them on a totally different level than a police officer can. And she can advocate for them. She can be their voice when sometimes they can't find their voice. Maybe it'll be the Helgas of this world that make more victims come back to court and get more convictions.
This man, Ray Crone, was known throughout Arizona as the Snaggletooth Killer. An unusual bite mark on a murdered woman resulted in his conviction and death sentence. A forensic expert told the jury that he was 100% certain that it was Crone who bit the victim.
He knew he was wrong, but he had already committed, and his comment to me was, "I'm in too deep."
The CBS Lounge is one of many neighborhood bars in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. Hank Arredondo owned the CBS Lounge. Kim Ancona managed it for him.
In the bar business, you have to have a nice personality. You have to be honest. And all those qualities Kim had.
On December 29, 1991, Kim closed the bar at the usual time, shortly after 1 a.m. As was his custom, Hank called to make sure there hadn't been any problems.
Kim answered. I asked her, I said, "Is everything okay? Do you have any problems?" And she said, "No." She said, "Hank, I know you're tired. Go to sleep, rest. I'll take care of it."
When Hank arrived the next day to open up, he noticed the door was ajar.
I know my bartender didn't leave the door open. I know I didn't, so something's wrong.
He first checked the safe, but none of the bar's money was missing. He went to the kitchen. No one was there. Then he checked the men's room.
I can close my eyes and still see that scene. I saw her laying in the bathroom, her eyes fixed, dead.
During Kim Ancona's autopsy, forensic photographers took numerous photographs of the bite wound on her upper chest. The photograph showed the killer had a distinctive bite pattern. His left front tooth pointed outward beyond the line of his other front teeth. Kim's address book contained the name and telephone number of a man named Ray Crone, someone she had often spoken with at the bar.
Kim Ancona had told several friends that she was interested in Ray, that she liked him, that she thought maybe something could happen. And those friends in turn relayed that to detectives.
Ray Crone was 35 years old, an Air Force veteran with no prior criminal record. Several bar employees told police that Kim had a date with Crone planned for the night of her murder.
When police talked to Kim's friends, the last person that they expected Kim Ancona to meet that night was Ray Crone. He was supposed to meet her to help close up the bar.
When questioned, Ray Crone said the two were just acquaintances. He denied there was any romantic relationship.
She was always a nice, congenial person, very friendly and outgoing. And I liked her personality. I liked, her bubbliness and things like that. There wasn't a relationship.
And Crone denied that he had plans to meet Kim at the bar, as her friends claimed. He also had an alibi. He shared a house with a co-worker who said Crone was home the night of the murder. But as police questioned Crone, they noticed that his left front tooth protruded slightly in a way that looked similar to the bite wound found on Kim's chest.
After looking at the bite marks on Kim Ancona's body, detectives pretty readily jumped to the conclusion that his teeth matched Kim Ancona, the bite marks found on her body.
Crone willingly agreed to provide an impression of his teeth by biting into a piece of styrofoam, which is commonly used since it's soft but still stable. Forensic odontologists examined a series of bite impressions from men who knew Kim Ancona. They found only one in which the left front tooth was clearly extended, just like the bite mark on the body. It was Ray Crone's.
I hear, brakes squealing, doors slamming. I look over and here's a police van unloading with officers, all armed, guns pointing at me, telling me to freeze. I was thrown on the ground, handcuffed, and taken off, and I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. That was the day of my arrest, New Year's Eve of 1991.
Crone maintained he was innocent, but he had no explanation for why his bite impression looked like the wound on Kim Ancona.
It was a very frustrating, aggravating, belittling situation where you're just saying, why? Why? Why won't somebody listen? Why won't somebody take a minute and look at this intelligently, responsibly? You're going to see that there is a definite problem here.
But the bite wound wasn't the only evidence against Crone. The perpetrator left his saliva on Kim's clothing. DNA tests of that saliva sample were inconclusive, but tests revealed the perpetrator had type O blood, the same blood type as Ray Crone. He was arrested and charged with murder. At his trial, prosecutors believed the bite impression evidence was the most convincing.
They hired a nationally known bite mark expert from Las Vegas, Nevada to testify that it was a 100% perfect match, better than a fingerprint.
That expert was Dr. Raymond Rawson, a forensic odontologist and also a senator in the Nevada State Legislature. At the trial, Dr. Rawson used this video in which photographs of the bite wound from Kim Ancona's body were superimposed on Ray Crone's bite impressions. Based on that evidence, Ray Crone was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death.
I didn't care if I was going to be in prison for something I didn't do. You might as well kill me. I mean, what was life? My whole life, everything I worked for, everything I stood for, 35-year-old man was gone.
The press called Crone the snaggle-tooth killer.
That judge believed the bite marks were a form of torture, and because of that, he sentenced him to death.
But if Crone was innocent, as he claimed, how could a nationally known forensic odontologist be wrong? Ray Crone had spent 3 years on death row for the murder of 35-year-old bar manager Kim Ancona. During that time, he formed his own opinions about the bite impression evidence used to convict him.
I mean, you basically could take a sharp object, stick it in skin a couple places, and have somebody say, oh yeah, that's a bite mark, and it matches him. And you could get, if you showed it to enough people, you'd have, somebody saying that, yeah, it's a match. That's junk.
All death penalty cases in Arizona are automatically appealed to the state Supreme Court. And fortunately for Crone, this bite mark videotape made by the prosecution provided grounds for an appeal. The court ruled that the defense team wasn't given enough time to review the tape before the trial. For Crone's retrial, his family asked Chris Plourde to represent him. Plourde specializes in difficult forensic cases.
I heard the story, that Ray Crone's on death row as a result of a bite mark. I didn't know whether other evidence supported his conviction or not. I was originally kind of skeptical because I hear these stories all the time.
Forensic experts hired by Plourde discovered that the hairs found on Kim's body were mongoloid hairs, meaning they were from someone of Asian or Native American descent. They also discovered that Ray Crone wore size 10.5 shoes. The shoe impression found on the kitchen floor of the bar was a size 9.5. The defense brought in Dr. Skip Sperber, a past president of the American Academy of Forensic Odontologists, to look at the bite wound evidence that more than anything else convicted Crone in his first trial. What Dr. Sperber told them came as a shock. He said he'd seen this evidence before. It had been sent to him before the first trial.
A good friend of mine, John Piakis in Phoenix, Arizona, called me and he asked me to look at this particular case, the People versus Crone. When I first viewed that case, thought there were too many inconsistencies for that to be a positive comparison between the teeth of Ray Crone, the suspect, and the victim's wounds.
Dr. Sperber told his colleague working for the Arizona prosecutors that this evidence was exceptionally weak.
We say on a range of 1 to 10, with 10 being very good, I would have rated this around 3 or 4, on the low side.
Here is a bite mark considered on the high end of the scale, a 9 or a 10. All of the teeth have made clear marks, and the relationships between the teeth can easily be seen. The bite wound on Kim Ancona had very few distinct markings. Dr. Sperber took the cast of Ray Crone's teeth and, using a low-tech but time-tested method, made a styrofoam impression and then traced the teeth patterns onto a transparency. He then placed a transparency over the top of the photo of the bite mark on Kim Ancona's body. Although the left front tooth in both marks was jutting forward, Ray Crone does not have any separation between his front teeth. The bite mark on the victim's body shows an obvious separation between those teeth. For Dr. Sperber, the results were clear.
If it's a good bite, it will really jump out at you and you will see immediately similarities. In the Crone case, there were no similarities.
So this was the key evidence, and to get the initial report back that a bite mark expert said it's not me, was like, oh wow, you know, something good can happen.
In the second trial, Dr. Raymond Rawson, the same bite mark expert from the first trial, repeated his testimony. He said there was no doubt the bite mark was from Ray Crone. A team of defense experts disagreed.
I could positively exclude Ray Crone as being the biter. I wasn't the only one. There were 3 other forensic dentists that are all board-certified, highly qualified guys, and they excluded him.
But the jury disagreed. They sided with the prosecution's expert and found Ray Crone guilty again.
What does it take? What is this beyond reasonable doubt? What is this innocent until proven guilty? It don't exist in the justice system. The one that I've seen, it did not exist for me.
We knew that there was another person in that bathroom at the time of death. There were unknown fingerprints that came back to somebody. There was a person who had shoes that were inconsistent with the defendant. The hairs were inconsistent with the defendant. You know, the FBI forensic people testified that these hairs were not Mr. Crone's. They were not the victim's. To me, logic and common sense told me it wasn't Mr. Crone that committed this crime, and the jury found the opposite result.
When I heard the verdict in the second trial, I really couldn't believe. It was total disbelief.
It was an absolute dog and pony show, the likes of which I've never seen before.
Ray Crone tried to reconcile himself to a life behind bars. But then, he got help from an unlikely source, the very system he had grown to despise. Ray Crone languished in prison for a crime that some of the country's top forensic experts said he didn't commit. Just before Crone's second trial, Dr. Richard Souveron, one of his defense experts, sat next to the prosecution's forensic expert, Dr. Rawson, at a scientific conference.
His comment to me was, I'm in too deep. He knew he was wrong, but he had already committed, and if that isn't a scary thing, I don't know what is. And I hated to see him get sucked in on something like this, and told him, you know, get out of this deal. Just say, I don't want to do it anymore, or I've changed my opinion, or I've listened to everybody else, and, you know, I've rethought my position. Anybody can make a mistake. I mean, none of us are above making mistakes. But he said, I'm in too deep, and that was the end of that conversation.
Through a spokesperson, Dr. Rawson denies that the conversation described by Dr. Souveron ever took place. It wasn't until 2001 that a new law offered Crone some hope.
Arizona, one of the first states in the United States, passed a new bill for post-conviction DNA testing, which allows convicted offenders access to evidence in post-conviction DNA testing if they contend that they were innocent.
So Crone's defense team asked the state of Arizona to test every piece of Kim Ancona's clothing for DNA. The saliva on Kim's blouse had already been tested, and the results were inconclusive. But her jeans had small blood stains. The prosecution believed the blood was Kim Ancona's. The jeans were sent to the state crime lab for a new DNA test that analyzes 13 different genetic markers. The test yielded unanticipated results. The blood on the jeans wasn't Kim Ancona's, and it wasn't Ray Crone's. But whose was it? To find out, forensic scientists entered this new DNA evidence into a national DNA database with genetic profiles of more than 1 million convicts from across the country. Profile after profile was checked and cross-referenced, and the database came up with a match. to this man, a 35-year-old Native American, Kenneth Phillips, who is currently in prison for child molestation. At the time of Kim Ancona's murder, Kenneth Phillips lived just 600 yards away from the CBS lounge.
He lived right behind the bar, and his nationality was an American Indian, which was consistent with some of the other DNA results we had and the hairs that was found at the scene of the crime.
When interviewed by police, Phillips made a startling admission. He said on the morning after Kim's murder, he woke from an alcoholic blackout to find his hands covered with blood. Then he saw news of the murder on TV. His fingerprints were among the unknown fingerprints found in the bathroom where the murder took place. His shoe size matched the print from the kitchen floor, and his bite impression had the same left front tooth protruding from the rest of his teeth. For Ray Crone, the ordeal was over. After serving 10 years and 4 months for a crime he didn't commit, he walked out of prison a free man.
I'd spent over 10 years in prison. I will never forget that day I got out. In fact, I commemorated it, so I won't ever forget it.
Forensic odontologists say that the problem with the Crone case was that Dr. Rawson told jurors bite marks could match like fingerprints, but that is rarely possible.
The best that a forensic dentist can give is reasonable certainty, and that means that that's the highest level we give. There is always a remote possibility that there's someone else that has teeth similar that could have left the pattern.
Ray Crone is trying to resume his life. Experts say the lesson of his case is that bite marks are rarely definitive and should only be used to exclude, not include, suspects. Above all, they say, bite mark analysis is more opinion than fact, and that this should always be made clear to jurors.
What was allowed in Mr. Crone's case was bad science, scientific explanations given by people who were unscientific in their methods.
Interpretation of a bite mark is what convicted me. Not the scientific, not the fingerprints that didn't match me, not they even had footprints that they couldn't match the shoes, the hair, not the DNA, none of that stuff. They used an interpretation of a bite mark to convict me.
That has no place in a courtroom, any more than perjury has a place in the courtroom. We shouldn't allow witnesses that lie, no matter what they say, whether it's regarding a scientific issue or any other issue. And in this case, it was clear that some of the scientific experts were actually misrepresenting their data and the scientific validity of what they were talking about.
In 4 years' time, this man suffered the loss of 2 wives, and his business went bankrupt.
You gotta say, this guy's gotta be the most unlucky person in the world.
Was it bad luck, or, as one forensic scientist asked, was it too coincidental? In 1994, 36-year-old Tim Boskowski and his 3 children moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to begin a new life. Just a few months earlier in North Carolina, Tim suffered the dual loss of his business and the accidental death of his wife, Elaine.
There's things you learn in life that only your mom could teach you. I'll never have a chance to find those things out.
The memories will never go away, but you kind of like had to put a backseat to that and kind of like move on.
Tim started a small company to make crowns and bridges for local dentists. And just 7 months after the death of his wife, he met 32-year-old Mary Ann Fullerton.
She met him at a dance. She came home all excited, saying she met the most wonderful man at the Catholic Singles Club that night, and all her friends figured, they hadn't seen her that excited in a while, and it just might be the person.
Mary Ann soon fell in love with Tim and his kids, Randy, Sandy, and Todd. When the couple married, Mary Ann included Tim's children in the ceremony.
She vowed to love them and cherish them and take care of them as long as she could. She hugged Randy. She kissed Sandy, she kissed Todd, and she was very emotional when she said this prayer in church.
Looking from the outside in, you wouldn't have known that she wasn't, a real mother per se.
There's Sandy and Todd. Todd, what do you have? Explain what you're going to do.
But just 18 months after the wedding, tragedy struck Tim Boskowski yet again. Shortly after midnight, on November 7th, 1994, Tim found his wife unconscious in the family hot tub.
Is the patient conscious right now? No. Okay. Is she breathing? I don't think so. They're trying to get her out of the water. Okay. Get her out of the water.
Mary Ann was rushed to the trauma center of Allegheny General Hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead.
It's probably the worst feeling in the world.
Tim told police that he and Mary Ann went into the hot tub together around 11 o'clock. They ignored or were unaware of safety warnings that they should spend no longer than 10 or 15 minutes in the hot water. And doctors warned against drinking alcohol in a hot tub. Tim and Mary Ann stayed in for over an hour, and Tim admitted the two had been drinking.
He was really pushing the fact that she was drinking heavily. 13 to 15 beers. Well, that's a lot of beer.
Later, Tim left to take a shower, and he said Mary Ann stayed behind. When Tim returned 20 minutes later, he found Mary Ann's lifeless body in the water.
She was immersed in a hot tub, the spa that had a temperature of approximately 104 degrees. The outside air in early November was in the 30s. She probably attempted to get out of the tub and had an episode of lightheadedness because of the blood rushing out to the cold extremities, and had a fainting spell, fell into the tub, and drowned.
Mary Ann's blood alcohol level was 0.22, over twice the legal limit of intoxication.
It's never pleasant nor easy to bash the deceased. They're not here to defend themselves, but the long and short of it in this case was that Mary Ann Boskowski did have a history of drinking. She had, I believe, 2 DUIs. We had an episode where we had witnesses that were in the choir with her at church were concerned about her drinking.
Once again, Tim Boskowski was a widower.
You gotta say, this guy's gotta be the most unlucky person in the world. To lose both wives in a 4-year period, how unlucky can you be?
On the night Mary Ann Boskowski died, police investigating the case were not sure whether it was a freak accident or something else. On the hot tub lay 2 wet beach towels. On the bottom of the tub lay the temperature gauge, which had broken loose from its housing, and a pair of women's eyeglasses. On the deck, officers also saw a wet pack of cigarettes, an ashtray, 2 cups, and a small box that held the breathing device Tim used to administer CPR on Mary Ann until paramedics arrived. The device typically is used on strangers to prevent disease.
That was suspicious. A person in his right mind would want to use this device on his own wife and take the time to leave her alone in that tub, to run down in the basement to find this thing, to bring it up.
Something else bothered police. A scratch on Tim Boskowski's neck. Detectives asked Tim to remove his shirt. They saw multiple scratches on both sides of his waist, his shoulder, and left thumb, and his left shin was bruised.
These superficial scratches on his back did not bleed. Okay, they were not surrounded by bruising or black and blue or hematoma contusions on his body. They were just little scratches.
Didn't necessarily take a trained police officer to figure out that there was really something wrong here.
Mary Ann's family was suspicious. They had heard rumors that Tim's first wife died under similar circumstances.
I asked Mary Ann, I said, I had heard that she had drowned in a bathtub. And Mary Ann said, oh, Aunt Ruth, she choked on something. And I said, what in the world was she eating in the bathtub that she would choke on? And she said, oh, I don't know. She said, Tim doesn't like to talk about it. He gets too upset.
Police in Greensboro, North Carolina confirmed that Tim's first wife, Elaine, died in a bathtub accident. 4 years earlier, Tim said Elaine was intoxicated when she came home from a church social function. Elaine went to take a bath. Tim said he went to bed. At the time, the couple's daughter Sandy was 6 years old. Both she and her father said they heard a loud noise in the bathroom.
I remember hearing a thud, and I remember getting up and being the one who woke my dad up.
Tim said the bathroom door was locked, which he forced open with a screwdriver. Inside, he found his wife on her back in the bathtub, unconscious, submerged in the water. Tim said he pulled her out of the tub and placed her over the shower door tracks to try to revive her.
He laid her across the tub, thinking that he could get the water out of her, because he felt like she had swallowed water, and that was keeping her from breathing.
Paramedics rushed Elaine to the Wesley Long Community Hospital, where she was pronounced dead.
I was in admiration of Elaine. I admired her strength. I admired her freeness to laugh. She had such beautiful qualities.
At the scene, police found vomit in the bathtub from Tim's resuscitation efforts, but no water in the tub or nearby.
How do you get her out and not be wet? How do you get her out and not be water everywhere? Like, what happened to the water? That was the thing that kept freaking me out.
And he said, I put her over the edge of the tub to try to resuscitate her or an attempt to save her life. Well, we have a mark that's consistent with putting a body over the edge of a tub.
The toxicology report showed Elaine's blood alcohol level was 0. She was not inebriated as Tim claimed. Despite the inconsistency, the coroner ruled the cause of death undetermined.
Well, you call it undetermined because I don't really believe a story, but I can't say that it didn't happen that way, but I'm suspicious, but you know, there's just not quite enough there.
I understand why she made the call that she did to begin with. I think, to answer your question directly, I think she did the best she could under the circumstances. I also believe that, that she probably felt very badly, personally, when the second woman died.
But if Tim Boskowski got away with murder the first time, would he be lucky enough to get away with it again with wife number 2? Tim Boskowski had been married 2 times. Both wives died under suspicious circumstances. The first in a bathtub, the second in a hot tub. Friends and relatives say the two wives strongly resembled each other.
And they actually wore their hairstyle the same. It was ironic because they both wore glasses that were Coke bottle thick. And that was another similarity. Both of them were very much involved in the Catholic Church.
The investigation into the death of Tim's first wife was inconclusive. Investigators were hoping for more in the autopsy of Tim's second wife.
It is impossible to know exactly what happened, but we can piece together some things in an intelligent and logical fashion.
The medical examiner found 53 bruises externally and internally on the upper arms, the back, and the upper neck.
We find some bruising and hemorrhaging on the lips and at the base of the gums, at the inside bottom portion of the lips. Then we find these bruises on the arms that are strongly suggestive of fingernail impressions. We do have several areas of focal hemorrhage. In the neck, in those small muscles we call strap muscles because they resemble small, elongated, rectangular straps. And we find small hemorrhages in the surrounding soft tissues.
Pressure to the side of the neck halts the blood flow in the carotid artery to the brain, and pressure to the vagus nerve alongside the carotid slows the heart muscle and respiration.
Bradycardia, as we call it, that slowing of the heart can set the stage, in some instances, uncontrollably, unpredictably, quite erratically, of a cardiac arrhythmia, an abnormal beating of the heart. In other words, the heart just stops beating, the lungs then stop functioning, and in a matter of 4 to 6 minutes, you're dead.
Dr. Weck says Mary Ann Boskowski did not drown.
I think that Mr. Boskowski strangled her. I think he applied pressure to her neck. I think that he held her arms. He may well have held her underwater, although we don't have any definitive evidence of prolonged immersion in water. I think that it was a staged drowning. I think that the death is due to strangulation.
Mary Ann's blood alcohol level, 0.22, was proof she was intoxicated. Dr. Weck says being intoxicated made it difficult for Mary Ann to fight off her attacker. The official ruling? Asphyxiation due to compression of the neck.
As the medical evidence incontrovertibly in our minds indicated, he strangled her to death in plain English.
It's not that easy to get away with something the second or third time that you try to do it.
If Tim murdered both of his wives as alleged, what was the motive? When prosecutors interviewed Mary Ann Boskowski's family and friends, they learned that Tim and Mary Ann had recently been on a cruise, and all was not happy.
Mary Ann said, if things don't get better, by the time I get back, I can always leave, and I'm taking the children with me.
There was evidence Tim's first wife, Elaine, was planning to divorce him as well.
As a grown woman in her 30s, a mother, she was discovering rock and roll from the 60s and 70s. She was really pursuing a wholeness as an individual. I don't think he killed the woman that he married. I think he killed the woman he was afraid of.
Tim's first wife had no life insurance to speak of, but Tim purchased a $100,000 life insurance policy on his second wife.
If and when the time came that he ever had to kill her, he would do it, and this time he'd have a lot more money than he got the first time.
Even after these two suspicious deaths, the children steadfastly defended their father.
They say that he's innocent. Hope they're in counseling.
Tim Boskowski was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of his first wife, Elaine, and his second wife, Mary Ann. Boskowski insisted he was innocent.
The evidence does not support that charge.
Prosecutors in Greensboro believe Tim followed Elaine into the bathroom that night in 1990. A later interview with one of the children revealed there was an argument. Before Elaine got into the shower, Tim forced her over the edge of the tub and held her there for 4 or 5 minutes, preventing her from breathing. At some point in the struggle, Elaine vomited before she died. The lack of water in and around the bathtub and the bruises on Elaine's body told a tale of violence. In Tim's second marriage to Mary Ann, there were problems once more.
He killed the first one, why not kill the second one? He got away with the first one, he figured he can get away with this one.
Pittsburgh prosecutors believe Tim and Mary Ann argued in the hot tub, possibly about her drinking or her interest in having children of her own. The evidence suggests Tim quickly overpowered Mary Ann, possibly covering her head with the beach towels to muffle her screams. Mary Ann fought for her life, splashing water onto the deck and scratching Tim's back. Tim knew from the first murder that strangulation victims sometimes vomit. This may be why he used the CPR mouthpiece in Mary Ann's case as protection while performing CPR when paramedics arrived.
All a charade, and all just a play. The acting. He was a terrible actor, by the way.
Tim's defense lawyer says that his client had no motive to kill his wife.
Tim's business up here was successful. They had a new house. Things were going well for them. The only bone of contention that anybody could point to at the time was that they had some arguments over the kids. And if that's a reason to charge a man with murder, then we're all in trouble.
In the Greensboro case and the Pittsburgh case, Tim's defense claimed that both of his wives had underlying heart conditions that caused accidental death.
If you believe in fairy godmothers and things like that, and you're prepared to believe that something with 100 billion to 1 odds can happen, then maybe you could argue that.
In Greensboro, North Carolina, the jury found Tim Boskowski guilty in the first-degree murder of Elaine, wife number 1. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the murder trial of Mary Ann, wife number 2, it was the same verdict, guilty. But that jury sentenced Boskowski to death.
I think his sentence should be tie bricks around him, chain them to him rather, and throw him in the Allegheny River and let him see what it's like to drown. But you're not going to use that.
I was always against the death penalty. Having lived through this situation, I've changed my views.
Tim Boskowski continues to maintain his innocence. His children say their father didn't receive fair trials because jurors in both cases heard about both deaths.
Well, without forensics, of course, this case would have been missed. And if a case like this happens in a jurisdiction in which there is no competent forensic pathologist, it could well be missed. You know, the marks on the neck are very, very subtle, very minimal.
She left a message for all of us with the trauma about her body that proved that this wasn't an accidental drowning.
He basically told the same story twice with 2 wives, you know? And in both cases, neither story held water, you know? So he was basically just all wet.
A young nurse develops a fatal illness, and her doctors wonder if she was infected by one of her patients. For forensic scientists, genetic researchers, and even the police joined together to solve the mystery. And they discovered this was no accident. In 1994, Janice Trahan was a single mother of 2 young children working as a nurse in the small town of Lafayette, Louisiana. A few years back, she started to develop some unusual symptoms, and she did what most health professionals do, sought the advice of her doctor.
Started with a pain in my eyes, ocular pain, movement of my eyes. Did seek some medical attention for that, and was told it was probably my sinuses, not to worry too much about it.
Janice visited several doctors before she finally saw her gynecologist for a checkup.
And then lymph nodes started to appear, swollen lymph nodes.
Suspecting she had a virus, her gynecologist ordered a full battery of tests. When she got the results, Janice was both thrilled and devastated.
At this checkup, not only did she find out she was pregnant, but she found out that she was HIV positive.
There were several possible explanations for how Janice had been infected with HIV. Janice worked as a hospital nurse. She may have been infected from one of the AIDS patients there. Another possibility was that Janice became infected from a previous lover. Janice's primary care physician at the time, Dr. Richard Schmidt, told colleagues his theory as to how Janice became infected.
He said, Janice is a slut. She sleeps around, she's in the bars at night, she goes to bars during the day, she goes home with strange men, and she's most likely contracted the disease from sleeping around.
Knowing her unborn child could be infected with HIV as well, Janice decided to end her pregnancy. And she faced the realization of her own personal agony.
My prognosis is, I know it's uncertain, I know that HIV is a terminal disease and there is no cure.
All of Janice's lovers of the last 10 years were asked to undergo HIV testing. Surprisingly, none tested positive for HIV. But Janice had her own theory as to how she became infected. It was a theory so unbelievable and so fantastic, few believed her, including the Lafayette Police Department. A small-town nurse, Janice Trahan, learned she had been diagnosed HIV positive in January 1995. 5 months later, she walked into District Attorney Mike Harson's office and told an improbable story about her own doctor, Richard Schmidt.
She began relating a story to me how she had had this relationship with Dr. Schmidt for a number of years, and that she had recently found out that she had AIDS or HIV, and she felt that he was responsible for it.
While Harson was skeptical, he told Lafayette Police Detective Jim Kraft to check out her story.
Well, she said that SOB injected me.
The story was hard to believe.
He wasn't running some kind of fat farm or something. He was a real live doctor with credentials and a background.
Richard Schmidt was probably one of the best physicians and most respected physicians in this community as far as his medical capabilities. His patients adored him.
Janice said she first met Dr. Schmidt years earlier when they both worked at the same hospital.
I was a new graduate from a licensed practical school, and I was going through the orientation phase of new employment at that hospital. That was the first time that I met him.
Janice was married at the time and had a young son. Dr. Schmidt was also married with 3 children. The two struck up a friendship.
What attracted me to Richard was his intelligence, a very brilliant doctor. I viewed him as very, very knowledgeable, excellent with his patients.
Eventually, they became romantically involved and started making plans to be together.
Basically, his promise to her at that time was that as soon as I'm able, I'm going to leave my wife and children, and you and I will be married and we can be together.
With that promise, Janice got a divorce.
Janice did leave her husband for the doctor, assuming that the doctor was going to leave his wife and family for her. She left hers, he never left his.
But Janice and Schmidt continued to see one another. In 1991, Janice became pregnant and gave birth to their son, Jeffrey. Schmidt paid child support and continued to promise he'd leave his wife, but he never did. Janice told police she tried to end the relationship many times, but said Schmidt made threats against her. Several times, he threatened to put sexually revealing pictures he had taken of her on the hospital bulletin board where she worked. Another time, he threatened to tell the dean of the nursing school that Janice had plagiarized some of her assignments.
She tried to start seeing other men, start dating other guys. The problem was that each time she attempted to establish a relationship outside of their relationship, Richard would intervene in that. He followed her on dates that she had with other men. He even threatened a couple of the guys that she had dated. One, he threatened to kill. Went to his home and threatened to kill him.
And Janice feared for her life.
Words to the effect, if you leave me, I'll fix you, I'll fix it, so that no man will want you.
Where she gave him an ultimatum. She told Richard, either leave your wife and marry me or we're through. Leave this girl. This is just her attempt to discredit this guy, to embarrass him, to get some bucks, to get some money out of him.
And even if Janice was right, how could anyone prove it? Detective Jim Kraft wanted to find some way to tell whether Janice Strawhan's incredible story was true, that her former lover, Dr. Richard Schmidt, had injected her with deadly HIV. Janice had donated blood just a few months earlier. Records showed that blood donation was not infected with HIV, which meant the infection was recent. The investigation began by checking Dr. Schmidt's telephone records. And just as Janice had told them, Dr. Schmidt had called her at 10:26 p.m. on August the 4th. But investigators needed proof that the injection Dr. Schmidt gave Janice contained HIV.
Investigators would discover early on in this case that HIV-tainted blood is not the easiest thing on earth to obtain. You do not just walk into a blood plasma unit or a clinic and say, oh, give me those 3 vials of labeled HIV and take them out.
Nurses in Dr. Schmidt's medical practice kept meticulous records of every patient that had blood drawn for testing. But if Dr. Schmidt took blood from one of his HIV patients, the virus wouldn't stay potent for very long.
You have about a 12-hour window before you have to inject it, or the virus won't survive outside the body.
Investigators wanted to see Dr. Schmidt's office records for August 4th, 1994, the day Janice said Schmidt gave her the injection.
Immediately we look for the 1994 book, but we can't find it. It's missing.
In Schmidt's desk, police found the sexually revealing photos he had taken of Janice that he had threatened to distribute. But they still couldn't find his 1994 office records. They were about to leave when they discovered a locked storage room full of boxes. At the very bottom of a pile was a box marked 1982. But could forensic scientists match the strain of HIV in Janice Trahan to Dr. Schmidt's patient? Prosecutors wanted to know whether Dr. Richard Schmidt took HIV-infected blood from one of his patients and injected it into his former lover, Janice Trahan.
Would there be a way through traditional science or traditional DNA testing to compare those two persons and those two samples, or samples from those two people, to determine whether they are in fact the same virus?
They turned to genetic researcher Dr. Michael Metzger at Baylor College of Medicine in Texas, one of the world's most renowned centers of human genome studies. Dr. Metzger told them that DNA tests of a virus are not the same as comparing DNA from individuals. That's because viruses change or mutate once they entered the body. But Dr. Metzger was willing to conduct an experiment to see if the HIV in Janice's body was similar to Dr. Schmidt's HIV patient, Don McClellan.
The methods that we use are called phylogenetic methods. That invokes, it takes advantage of the virus mutability. As the virus mutates, it evolves in different individuals. We can use that evolution using mathematical models to actually trace back relationships between viruses if they exist.
Dr. Metzger looked at blood samples from 30 individuals infected with HIV in Lafayette, Louisiana, including the samples from Janice Trahan and Don McClellan. He discovered that 28 of those samples had mutated in ways vastly different from one another. But in 2 of the samples, the viruses were nearly identical and were therefore closely related. The samples were from Janice Trahan and Don McClellan.
When we looked at the viruses, the odds that we found were 1 in a million of excluding the patient being the source of Janice Trahan's virus.
That, for us, was corroboration of our theory that Schmidt had used the virus of one of his patients to use to infect Janice Trahan.
In July of 1996, Dr. Schmidt was charged with attempted second-degree murder. But prosecutors were faced with another scientific riddle.
When ultimately Janice was diagnosed, she was also diagnosed not only HIV positive, but with hepatitis C. The patient whose blood had been drawn on August 4th was HIV positive, but did not have hepatitis C.
When investigators looked again at Dr. Schmidt's medical records, they noticed one more patient listed with no lab sticker next to her name. That patient had blood drawn 2 days before Janice's nighttime injection, but her blood was never sent to the lab. That patient's medical record showed she had hepatitis C.
The doctor not only appears to have infected his lover with HIV, but combined it with hepatitis C from yet another patient to create this even more lethal cocktail that he injected her with that night.
Dr. Schmidt maintained his innocence. He said he had an alibi for the night of August 4th. He said he was home with his wife, except for 20 minutes when she was taking a bath. But a police officer drove from Dr. Schmidt's home to Janice's and back in about 17 minutes, even allowing time for the injection. And there's another question. Why did Dr. Schmidt keep his medical records from 1994 rather than throw them away? Detective Kraft thinks he knows the answer.
He kept something as a trophy. He has something from that crime that he can look at, that he can touch, that he can see, that reminds him that he got away with this.
Along with the scientific and circumstantial evidence, it was the words of Janice Trahan that echoed in the jury's mind during Dr. Schmidt's trial.
Richard made a lot of promises to me that he did not keep, but he did keep one, and that would be that he would kill me. And I feel like that's a death sentence that I have.
Prosecutors believe that Dr. Schmidt fulfilled that promise when Janice ended their relationship. He did it by injecting the HIV and hepatitis C-tainted blood into Janice's arm, and did it on the same day he took the HIV sample, making sure it maintained its potency. Despite his medical degree, Dr. Schmidt never realized that forensic DNA testing could compare the mutations of the HIV in his patient Don McClellan and match them to the HIV in Janice.
To me, what he did was something that's really atrocious when you think about it. I mean, here's a man who took an oath to preserve people's lives and to do everything he could to preserve people's lives. And in this fashion, he basically did everything just the opposite.
On October 23, 1998, he was convicted of attempted second-degree murder and sentenced to 50 years hard labor.
Most people carry out these attacks with a gun or a knife or a club, but here was a guy who had to think about what he was going to do, how he was going to do it, what means was he going to use to effect her death. And it was just so diabolical and so evil.
Juries like to see, be able to see a smoking gun or the knife or the baseball bat or whatever it is that's used to commit the act. And in this case, we really didn't have it. We didn't have that tangible item. But the scientific evidence gave us that chance, because what it essentially boiled down to it, unfortunately, is that these two individuals from whom these samples were drawn were our smoking guns.
Janice Trahan is remarried and lives with her 2 sons in the same house where she was infected that August night.
I just try to put things in the past and just keep moving forward. And my outlook on life, I think, is very good. I appreciate life more, stop and look at the flowers and treasure each day that I do have with my family and my husband. It's much more meaningful.
This case made forensic history. It was the first time in the United States that 2 HIV cases had been linked using DNA testing in a criminal case.
The significance of the DNA testing is that we attempted to use something that had not been done before, and attempted to strike out in our jobs as prosecutors to find a way to prove the elements of a crime.
We use the most advanced tools for understanding the relationship between the DNA sequences from HIV, but they're pretty standard. The impact and the contribution was to bring this new methodology into the judicial system and to use it as a tool for an investigation of alleged crimes.
An affluent young woman was found dead in her home while her husband was off on a sailing trip. Police uncovered allegations of sex parties and wife swapping. But it was an old movie, an overheard telephone call, and an air conditioner that cracked the case. Ed and Ellen Sherman lived in Niantic, Connecticut for the entire 16 years of their marriage. Ed taught business at a local community college and was a member of Mensa, an organization for people with exceptionally high IQs. Ellen was 5.5 months pregnant and worked in the family publishing business.
Ellen Sherman was a sweetheart. Everybody that met Ellen just adored her. She had a smile and a friendly hello for everyone.
On a Friday night in August of 1985, Ed left for a week-long sailing trip with 4 friends.
They are always fun, and we always have a great time. And that's great sailing from Maine down. We stop at the Vineyard in Nantucket and what have you. Boys' night out type thing.
On Sunday afternoon, 2 days into the trip, Ed called his pregnant wife to make sure she was okay. After numerous calls went unanswered, Ed contacted Len Fredrickson, a good friend of the couple, and asked him to check on Ellen.
I got over there when it was just starting to get dark, and I could hear the air conditioner running in the house. The lights were on the inside and the outside. I checked all the doors. They were locked. It was locked up, which was very strange because they always left their house open. I used to kid Ellen about, you're going to come home some night and there'll be nothing left in your house.
No one answered the door, so Fredrickson entered the home through an unlocked window. Inside was the family dog. He called for Ellen, but there was no answer. Upstairs, he opened the bedroom door and found Ellen's lifeless body on the bed.
I had no idea what had happened. I didn't think that she'd been murdered, and why would I think that anybody would murder this wonderful person?
It appeared at first glance as if she were the subject of a sexual assault, and her night clothing was on the floor, and her underwear and the bedding.
Red ligature marks around Ellen's neck indicated strangulation. The medical examiner determined that the murder occurred sometime Saturday night or early Sunday morning based on rigor mortis, the temporary stiffening of the body after death. The lines on her fingernails were evidence they had been bent backwards.
Could be because during the strangulation, victim tried to keep themselves free. And meanwhile, tried to struggle with the perpetrator, may scratch the arm.
Police found no signs of forced entry, and no valuables were missing, which ruled out robbery. Using a ship-to-shore radio, a policeman gave Ed Sherman the bad news.
He talked to him for a while, which I wasn't listening to, but he eventually did hand me the microphone and said, Wayne, take this, it's the police. They said Ellen's been killed.
Detective Mike Malchik soon learned that the Shermans' lives were far from ordinary. It was a lifestyle of deception, sex, and intrigue. The medical examiner estimated that Ellen Sherman was murdered sometime over the weekend while her husband was sailing in the Atlantic Ocean with friends. Ed Sherman told investigators that he last spoke with his wife on Friday night from his friend's house.
They said that Mr. Sherman did get on the phone when he's telling his wife, go to the bank to make this deposit, all these different things.
And Ed Sherman was unusually candid about their sex life.
If you had to describe your marriage, what type of a marriage would you say you had? Unusual. Okay. In what sense? I've been having an affair with another woman for a number of years, and Ellen has been accepting of it up until relatively recently.
And the girlfriend had a child, and it was his child.
The woman was Ed's co-worker, Nancy Prescott.
She was very different than Ellen. In fact, Ellen used to refer to her as Ed's Valley girl. She was blonde and very different looking. Ed wanted an open marriage. He encouraged Ellen to have affairs.
And Ed Sherman's lifestyle was unusual in other ways.
I remember being at a New Year's Eve party at their house. I believe it was 1984. They had several couples there, and I guess they were going to swap partners. I was with a young lady, and Ed asked me if I was interested, and what I asked the young lady that I was with if she was interested, and I just said, we'll leave, and we did. So Ed was really the one that was pushing that type of situation. Ellen did not want that in her life.
I was totally unaware of and would not have guessed it.
Since there were no signs of forced entry, police suspected Ellen may have known her killer.
From downstairs to upstairs, everything in proper order. No sign of a ransack or violent struggles. If a foreign intruder, usually we see some sign of struggle.
Dr. Henry Lee, at the time the director of Connecticut's crime lab, was called in to assist investigators. Dr. Lee examined photos of the ligature marks on Ellen Sherman's neck and found a faint pattern.
And this pattern is a zigzag pattern, which is so unique. Initially, we don't know where they come from.
Lee compared this to the clothing found at the scene, including the torn panties.
Subsequently, when we start stretching the panty, you can see this zigzag pattern. The space start opening up and shows identical pattern as what left on the neck.
But other evidence showed that Ellen was strangled with bare hands, not the panties. The autopsy revealed the cricoid cartilage in the neck had been fractured, something which cannot be accomplished during ligature strangulation. Dr. Lee believes the killer wrapped the panties around her neck afterwards in order to stage the crime scene to make it look like a sex crime. On the bedsheet under ultraviolet light was biological evidence investigators hoped would identify the killer.
Extremely unusual is the bedsheet we found close to 150 to 200 individual semen stain. That's a lot of semen stain.
This biological evidence was too badly degraded for DNA testing, which meant the material had been there for quite some time and had survived laundering. While searching for suspects, police discovered that Ed's mistress, Nancy Prescott, may have been angry with Ed and Ellen. Ed had recently agreed to end the affair to save his marriage.
When Ellen got pregnant, she said, I want you to stay home and be a father to this baby and be there when it's born and give up the girlfriend.
So they talked it out, and Ed said that he was willing to give up his girlfriend and that he would be a father and a husband to Ellen.
And then I terminated the relationship with this other woman. I was angry because I had to make a decision. And so I told Nancy, can't handle it anymore. She kept asking, why?
Detectives asked Ed to take a polygraph test. He agreed. The results were inconclusive. And Nancy Prescott had an alibi for the day of the murder. The trail of the killer was starting to turn cold.
Mike Malchek had promised Ellen's mother, Rose, that he would stay on the case and that they would find out who did this to her daughter.
Then Malchek got lucky. He learned there was a movie that featured a murder identical to Ellen Sherman's. Would this film lead police to the killer? Initially, police didn't consider Ed Sherman a suspect in his wife's murder, since he was on a sailboat in the Atlantic Ocean the day she died.
This case is in the middle of the ocean. Have perfect alibi. And 4 witnesses. time of the death become very important in many homicide investigation, because that result, time of the death, you can impeach a witness statement or suspect statement, or collaborate with the suspect statement. However, time of the death is a difficult area.
Rigor mortis is one way to estimate the time of death. This is what a body looks like when rigor mortis occurs. A stiffening of the entire body that lasts between 12 and 24 hours after death. When Ellen's body was discovered, it was in the final stages of rigor mortis and becoming more pliable. In looking through the investigator's report, Dr. Lee discovered an important clue. It was something Len Fredrickson said when he found Ellen's body.
It was like open a freezer almost.
The air conditioner was going full blast. The person later described it as being extremely cold in the room, colder than a normal person would have their air conditioner on.
A freezing cold room will slow decomposition and the progress of rigor mortis. This meant that Ellen Sherman's murder could have occurred earlier than originally estimated.
Here it's clear the time of the death is definite, not Sunday. Although we don't know exactly hours, every indicator pointed out is Friday sometime.
If Ellen was murdered on Friday night, then Ed Sherman would have had plenty of time to commit the crime. Police also learned that Sherman was wearing long pants and a long sleeve shirt on the sailing trip in August.
And looking back on it, we were all in shorts and t-shirts, and he had long pants on and a turtleneck. I never saw him on the boat with short sleeves on.
Since Ellen's fingernails had been damaged, police suspected that Ed might have been hiding scratch marks. Ed vigorously denied this and insisted his wife was alive when he left. He said he even spoke to her from his friend's home by telephone in front of witnesses. If true, Ed couldn't have been the killer.
Have a good weekend.
But Ed wasn't the only one listening in to that conversation. His friend's daughter was too.
She picked up and was getting ready to make a call, I guess.
She said, well, I heard Mr. Sherman talking on the phone.
And she says, well, I was on the other end, and it was just ringing and ringing, and I heard him saying, I love you too, and there was nobody there.
And they said, why didn't you hang up? And she said, well, I thought it was very unusual because he was talking to a ringing phone.
It's 5 minutes after he leaves his house, he fakes a phone call with his wife. I mean, that's hard to explain.
Little did he know that, you know, some 9-year-old girl was going to bring him down. He wasn't as smart as he thought he was.
And there was another interesting development. A witness told police that she had run into Ed on the morning of his sailing trip. During the conversation, Ed recommended she watch a movie he particularly enjoyed called Blackout. In the film, a man kills his wife and children, puts the bodies inside the house, then manipulates the crime scene in order to fool forensic scientists and mask the true time of death.
Richard Woodmark, who plays the detective, comes out to the press and says, the time of death is going to be very difficult to determine because the bodies were put in a cold room with the air conditioner turned all the way up.
The medical examiner estimates they were dead for at least 3 days. The air conditioning system in the house was turned on, apparently to slow the decomposition of the bodies.
Was it possible that Ed did the same thing? Friends say he displayed a morbid fascination about details of his wife's murder.
He asked me once, he asked me 10 times, do you know if they've determined the time of death? He was very interested in that. He also asked me one time if I knew how a body decomposed. I thought that was a very strange question. I said, no.
Truth is absolutely stranger than fiction. I mean, there are so many things that happen in real life that there's no need to make anything up. I mean, it's awful.
Police and prosecutors alike wondered what motivated Ed Sherman to kill his wife. Despite the apparent reconciliation, friends say Ellen decided she wanted a divorce. Since Ellen was the majority owner of the family business, she allegedly told Ed that she would leave him with almost nothing.
And Ellen said he could have his girlfriend and his sailboat, and that's it. So I said to her, I said, are you sure this is what you want to do? She said, I can't live like this anymore. She says, he's never going to be a husband and a father to our children. He's always going to have this double life.
Prosecutors believe that Ed Sherman carefully planned his wife's murder. The couple had a light dinner, and then, while Ellen was changing her clothes in the bedroom, prosecutors say Ed strangled her to death. The forensic evidence shows that Ellen was dead before Ed wrapped the panties around her neck to make the murder appear to be a sex crime. Inspired by the movie Blackout, he set the air conditioner to its coldest setting, closed the door, and left for the sailing trip around 7 p.m. Later that night, to cement his alibi, he staged the call to his wife in front of his friends, not knowing his friend's daughter was listening in. Sherman called Len Fredrickson from the sailboat on Sunday evening, asking him to check on his wife, hoping the cold temperature of the bedroom would mask the true time of death, just like the movie. It fooled forensic scientists, but only for a while.
Of course, witness play an important factor. The first person discovered the body felt the temperature call. The young lady listened on the phone. Of course, no, he's lying. By signs, we fill the gap. Shows something is impossible. The time of the death, Sunday, is impossible. Then we show what's more probable, a Friday. Then we show the weapon and the motive. He almost got away. Very close.
Detective Malchik arrested Ed Sherman for murder.
He knew that I knew that he was the one that had murdered his wife. And when he saw me, he looked at me, and I just walked in. I was the first one in, and he looked over, and I said, Ed, it's time. And he turned white. He started to sweat, and he knew it was time.
And the forensic evidence mattered most to jurors. During deliberations, they asked to hear again the testimony of Dr. Lee and the medical examiner, particularly on the time of death.
One of the jurors said that it boiled down to the fact that they figured he had the time and the opportunity and the motive.
6 years after his wife's death, the jury found Ed Sherman guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. While Ed Sherman never admitted guilt, he did show some remorse.
He said she deserved a better lifestyle, and then he apologized for leading such an indulgent lifestyle. And then he said, I do not know who killed Ellen.
After spending only 3 years in prison, Ed Sherman died of a heart attack at the age of 52.
He was a very bright individual, high IQ, and liked to make people know that he was smarter than you. That's the way he made me feel. And I've heard the same from other people. Ed thought he could have whatever Ed wanted.
He's got to be an awful cold person to be able to do that. That's a hands-on crime. and she's pregnant with his own child, and it is a son. So he's a cold, calculating person. Doesn't deserve any sympathy from anybody.
But Sherman was not smarter than the detectives and scientists who investigated the case.
In all my years of doing this, I've never seen a case where a body was placed in an air-conditioned room and it was turned up to the maximum degree to apparently throw off the time of death.
This case demonstrates how important the teamwork. Detectives, witness, scientists, we work together, did not give up.
Police in Illinois searched for a killer who was careful enough not to leave fingerprints, but who didn't bother to mask his identity. This is how a forensic scientist with some fancy footwork identified a perpetrator when not one, but two eyewitnesses could not. July 19, 1991 was typically hot and humid in Peoria, Illinois. Once the sun set and the temperature subsided, it was a perfect night for a cookout.
It was hot, very hot, and we had the windows open, and the back door was open.
Casey Johnson and her roommate Jennifer Logsdon spent the evening with Jennifer's fiancé, Tommy Smith.
After we ate dinner, we went up to the grocery store and got stuff to make blizzards, and came back, and we moved the coffee table out of the way and pulled our mattress out into the living room so we could all three lay down and watch TV.
They all watched a Stephen King horror movie, and less than 15 minutes later, Jennifer fell asleep. She awoke to sounds that didn't come from the television.
I could hear screaming.
She turned and saw Tommy fighting an intruder who was armed with a knife. Casey ran to the phone to call police.
I can't hear you. You need to hide.
Before police arrived, the intruder wounded Tommy. Then, he went after Jennifer.
I just kept screaming as loud as I could. He just kept stabbing me all over.
What's going on? Huh? An intruder.
Incredibly, Jennifer grabbed the knife from her assailant.
I fought as hard as I could. I was hitting him and kicking.
But her actions only fueled his anger. The intruder got the knife back and attacked again.
And that's when he cut me twice and just left me for dead.
This person that broke into your house, does he have any weapons? Hello?
He then found Casey in the bedroom on the phone with the police. Jennifer managed to run to a neighbor's home for help.
I can't move. My throat is slit. Who are you? A lot of blood. Can you describe this person that did it?
No, I can't.
How about maybe what he was wearing?
I don't remember.
When the police arrived, the intruder was gone.
I told the police I knew I was dying, but go and save Tommy and Casey.
But it was too late for 21-year-old Tommy Smith. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Jennifer and Casey were rushed to St. Francis Medical Center.
My father came to get me at work, and he told me that Tommy had been killed. And I immediately freaked out in disbelief, no, it wasn't him, not Tommy. And it wasn't soon after that it finally sunk in that, he was killed.
Tommy Smith's actions were quite heroic. He took it upon himself to apprehend the suspect, put him in a chair, and stand over top of him, hold him there until the police arrived. And in doing so, he sacrificed his life.
I don't think Tommy could have ever lived with one of them getting killed, and especially Jennifer.
Police hoped the two girls would be able to identify their attacker. Connie Smith had to do what every parent dreads: plan the funeral of a child.
He was the neatest kid a mother could have. He was the best baby, best little boy, most loving young man. Even if he got mad, he never stayed mad long. He would have made a great dad. He would have made a great husband, because I know he was a great son.
Tommy's fiancée, Jennifer, was in the intensive care unit near death. She had sustained multiple stab wounds, a cut throat, and a punctured lung.
If Tommy Smith wouldn't have been in that house, those two young ladies wouldn't be here today. They'd be dead. And I believe that.
The crime scene gave mute testimony to the girls' intense will to survive.
He really did a number on both of the young ladies.
They both exhibited a great deal of courage. They had very strong constitutions. They had a very strong will to live.
Gradually, their conditions improved, but when they spoke to police, they could remember very little.
He just kept stabbing me all over, and nothing hurt. And I didn't see any blood either.
She did state that a black male had entered the home. She wasn't sure how.
And I can't remember what he looked like.
Investigators would have to rely on the crime scene for clues. They quickly concentrated their attention on the assailant's point of entry, a bedroom window.
The outside screen was jarred and out of place and cut.
Investigators were shocked by the amount of blood found in the home.
I think once he started cutting, he went into a frenzy. And at that point, he felt the only way that he could prevent the police from finding out who did this to these kids was to kill all three of them.
In one of the bedrooms, amid the clutter, police found the wooden handle of the murder weapon.
When the handle of the knife was located at the crime scene, it speaks of our suspect's panic and his hurry to flee the scene.
Mrs. Johnson had grabbed the blade of the knife and was able to break it loose from the handle.
Unfortunately, there were no fingerprints on it. Police found a party invitation on the floor near the point of entry. Police used black magnetic powder to see if the killer may have knocked it to the floor during the struggle. They were looking for the friction ridges of a fingerprint.
On top of the friction ridges are pores, and that's where the perspiration comes from when the person sweats. And when they touch an item, they may or may not leave their identification through those unique characteristics.
On the invitation, Gary Siebenthal found what appeared to be a partial palm print. A print that did not belong to Tommy, Jennifer, or Casey. While interviewing neighbors, police were surprised to learn that despite the girls' screams, no one saw the killer leave the crime scene. Police thought they had solved the case when they found blood on the screen door of a neighbor's home, Gene Brown.
And he explained that he had cut himself on the lower leg carrying the garbage out earlier in the night.
Tests revealed the blood was Brown's, and investigators found broken glass in his trash can, which Brown said had caused the cut. Brown's palm print did not match the print on the party invitation at the crime scene. And neither Jennifer nor Casey identified their next-door neighbor as the assailant. Police suspected the killer lived nearby since he fled the scene on foot. And it was the foot which would lead police to the killer. Gary Siebenthal refused to give up in the search for Tommy Smith's killer. In reviewing the case, Siebenthal recalled something Jennifer and Casey had both remembered about the intruder.
I ended up taking the knife away from him because he had socks wrapped around his hands.
She did describe him as wearing, she thought, khaki shorts. He was also described as being a black male, approximately 6 foot, 6'1", slim build, with a mustache.
And the girls remembered something else. The intruder was barefoot. Why would a killer enter a home wearing socks on his hands, but nothing on his feet? And if the killer lived nearby, why didn't he cover his face?
He's breaking into a home where people can recognize him, will certainly recognize him. And I think by the fact that he went in there quietly, armed with a knife, that his intention all along was to do great harm to both the young ladies living there.
But the fact that he was barefoot quickly became the central focus of the investigation.
That led a little insight into what the strange print was on the card, because it didn't look like a palm print to the crime scene investigators. It was something strange that they really hadn't seen before.
Suddenly, it occurred to Siebenthal that the print on the party invitation might not be a palm print at all.
If you look at certain parts of the palm, they can mimic parts of the foot because they have the same characteristics. They have dots, short ridges, and bifurcations and trifurcations.
Was it possible that the perpetrator knocked the party invitation to the floor and then stepped on it? If so, the hot, muggy July night created the perfect conditions for leaving a print behind.
How he does that is through the moisture that the individual leaves in his fingerprints and his palm prints.
Siebenthal began the painstaking task of identifying the print. Using a microscope and a pointer, he examined the friction ridges, every bifurcation and trifurcation, which are points where one line divides into 2 or 3. Police have a fingerprint database they can refer to, but they don't collect footprints. On a hunch, police asked the girl's next-door neighbor, Gene Brown, for his.
We took his footprints through a search warrant, but taking footprints is something that the average person doesn't have to do when they're taken into custody.
Siebenthal compared Brown's footprints to the print on the party invitation.
You have to look for the uniqueness of those points of identification, and we found it on the outside left heel print of Gene Autry Brown.
Gary Siebenthal had a match, and it was the first time in the history of the Peoria Police Department that a footprint had been recovered from a crime scene.
Why he had no shoes on, I'll have no idea, but it wasn't very smart. It wasn't the smartest thing you can do.
The average person doesn't realize that their footprints, in fact, are inherent to that particular person. They are as individualistic as fingerprints are. So, you know, he would have been as well off to leave the socks on his feet and put another pair on his hands.
In a search of Brown's home, police discovered a set of knives which were identical to the murder weapon. And they also found Casey Johnson's purse. Police found bloody socks with the broken blade of the murder weapon inside. And in one of the socks was Gene Brown's wedding ring. Finally, investigators found tiny traces of blood in Brown's hair.
He must have had a great deal of blood on him when he left the house after attacking the 3 individuals, and he still had blood on his body.
DNA tests of the blood sample showed it was from all 3 victims, Tommy, Jennifer, and Casey. Gene Brown was arrested and charged with murder.
He had a wife. He had a cute little boy. He had a family that cared for him, you know. And because he chose drugs, he took my son away from me.
When you entered the house and started across the bedroom towards the door leading
I
to
didn't
the
see anyone until I got in the living room. By that time, the guy had jumped me, grabbed my head.
Do you understand that you have the right to remain silent? You do not have to talk to me or answer any questions unless you voluntarily choose to do so?
Correct.
When police confronted Gene Brown with the mountain of evidence against him for the murder of 21-year-old Tommy Smith and the attacks on Jennifer Logston and Casey Johnson, he confessed.
Did you stab him with the knife?
I can't say I stabbed him. So I don't know. We were struggling. It was more or less, he was trying to get the knife and I was trying to keep the knife, and at the same time, he was being cut.
Did you and he struggle for any length of time?
I'd say about 45 seconds.
What ended the struggle?
He walked away and fell to the floor.
Brown admitted using crack cocaine on the day of the attack. After having dinner with his wife and infant son, Brown said he needed money to buy more cocaine.
Went to bed, got up, put my clothes on, and went next door.
He removed his shoes so he could walk quietly and used his socks to cover his hands to make sure he didn't leave any fingerprints. He entered the victim's home through an open window by removing the screen. But he never realized his feet could leave the very same prints as his fingers, just as distinctive, just as incriminating. Tommy Smith fought valiantly, but was no match for Brown's knife. Jennifer slipped out of the house when Brown was in the other room. Casey survived by playing dead after she was attacked. Prompt medical attention saved them both. Tommy Smith's best friend still struggles with the absurdity of it all.
It disgusted me that somebody would take a life like that for $1 so he could go get high. It was very, very senseless, a very senseless act.
You know, losing him so early, what made it bearable was he had 20 years and he enjoyed every one of them. He knew how to enjoy life.
Despite his confession, there are still parts of Brown's story detectives don't believe. Jennifer and Casey lived next door to Brown. Police think that Brown broke in with the intent to rape and kill the 2 girls and didn't realize that Tommy Smith had stayed over that night.
He deliberately went barefooted just to stop it, to hold the noise down. He wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. He took a knife with him that was still encased in a cardboard sheath so that he would not injure himself. He made no effort whatsoever to cover his face. And he's going into the home next door.
But it takes a bit of an evil individual to take a life hand to hand, let alone attempt to take 3. He went from a sneak thief to a murderer within moments.
In exchange for his guilty plea, Gene Brown was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Tommy Smith and 30 years for each count of attempted murder.
He did this in order to escape the chance of facing the death penalty in a trial. It was a capital case, and I think probably it was a good move on his part.
Little did Gene Brown know that Tommy Smith's mother would not have pushed for the death penalty.
I could not stand the thought of another mother standing over a casket with her son so cold, and another family going through what this family's went through, you know. Having a son in prison for the rest of his life is bad, but nothing is worse than burying one.
I don't really know where to begin. I don't know why this happened, but it did. And all the time I've been sitting here talking to you guys, I wish there was a way that I could take it back, but it's done.
He would express remorse and state how sorry he was that this thing had happened. But at the same time, he would protect himself by not being able to recall just what had occurred.
It didn't happen. And I'm still asking myself why. I don't know why.
Jennifer Logsdon is now married with children, but she still lives with emotional and physical scars from that attack.
He said he was sorry. He didn't mean to do it. And I can't forgive him yet. Yeah, I think he got what he deserved.
When you get caught doing something, you say, I'm sorry. Would you say you're sorry if you didn't get caught? I say, I don't know. I don't believe that.
If Gene Brown hadn't gone barefoot that night, investigators wouldn't have recovered the valuable footprint that placed him at the crime scene.
Well, I think it's the greatest irony of all, to be so smart and get caught.
It just goes to show you the best laid plans of mice are men. You know, he in fact tried to go in barefoot so that he would be quiet and be able to move through the house quietly, and in fact left behind, you know, a tremendous piece of evidence.
When you're able to point out to your suspect that they, in fact, are the best witness that we have against themselves. And in the case of this particular footprint that was left, he did seal his own fate.
The murder of a prominent businessman in Colorado was particularly difficult to solve since the killers left virtually no forensic evidence at the scene. But information gathered from a small-town diner, an endocrinologist, and a forensic botanist took a bite out of the chief suspect's alibi. At an elevation of 7,000 feet, Steamboat Springs, Colorado boasts one of the largest ski mountains in North America. Lifetime resident Jerry Boggs found the splendor of the small-town ski resort inescapable. The family business, Boggs Hardware, had been on Main Street for 63 years.
Jerry was the kind of person that everybody thought he was their best friend. He was a great guy. People loved him. He was kind, generous. You could trust him with your life.
On October 22, 1993, Boggs didn't show up for work as he usually did. Jerry's brother went to his home and found him dead inside the back door. He had been shot to death. Nearby was a plastic bag and a bloody shovel.
So it appeared that he had been ambushed. Someone was hitting him in the head with a shovel and far enough to hit the overhead beam.
Boggs often kept his doors unlocked, but there were no valuables missing. Investigators could find no foot impressions, foreign hairs, or fibers.
We didn't have any direct evidence. We didn't have any fingerprints, any DNA, anything that directly connected anyone to the crime scene.
A neighbor reported seeing two suspicious-looking men near Boggs' home on the day of the murder. And police had another suspect, Jerry Boggs' ex-wife, Jill Coit. The two got married when Jill became pregnant with Jerry's baby.
I don't think he was in love with her. I think that she tricked him into getting married.
The marriage lasted for only 7 days. Jerry had the marriage annulled when he learned that Jill hadn't gotten a divorce from her previous husband.
I couldn't figure out what in the world he was doing with this woman, because in 1 hour, I could tell that she was just off the wall. Absolutely the strangest person, and not at all suited for Jerry.
After the annulment, the two barely spoke.
And she would come to Steamboat and she would call up people that Jerry knew, talk about the child and how Jerry had thrown them out and he was a horrible person.
When questioned, Jill said she had an alibi for the night of Jerry's murder. She said she was camping at the Poudre National Park 150 miles away. Her new boyfriend, Michael Backus, corroborated her alibi. Investigators were left to wonder who killed Jerry Boggs and why. The autopsy revealed that Jerry Boggs had been beaten with a shovel and shot 3 times in the chest with a .25 caliber pistol. Investigators closely analyzed the shovel for clues.
The shovel itself was very old. The wood was very porous. Our lab people concluded that whoever was using it was probably wearing gloves. So there were bloody hand prints on it, and you could see where fingers had been, but there was no ridge detail with which to make an identification.
In addition to the head injuries and bullet wounds, there were some other injuries that experts couldn't explain. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, methods that are crude and sometimes inaccurate, the medical examiner estimated that Boggs died sometime the night before his body was found. Police had 2 leads. A neighbor reported seeing 2 men near Boggs' home earlier in the afternoon on the day Boggs was killed. Boggs' ex-wife, Jill Coit, was also a suspect. She and Boggs had been fighting over a $100,000 loan Boggs made to Jill's bed and breakfast hotel during their brief marriage.
It was an embarrassment, too. You know, you live in a small town, you know all these people, you get married, you've never been married before you get married, and all of a sudden, you've got this can of worms to deal with that was just so much. It was just horrible for him. I'm sure at times he probably just wanted to crawl under the rug.
Jill had an alibi for the night of the murder. Investigators wanted to make sure Boggs was killed at night and not earlier in the day. For a better estimate of the time of death, Dr. Doberson decided to analyze the undigested food in Boggs' stomach.
So if we could find out where he ate and at what time he ate, we could really narrow down the time of death.
In retracing Boggs' steps on the day of the murder, investigators learned that Jerry opened the hardware store at 10 o'clock as he did every morning. He worked for a while, then walked 2 doors down to the shack for breakfast. There, he ordered the same meal he always did: eggs, toast, and hash brown potatoes.
The folks in the cafe said, oh yeah, he stopped by here and had his usual.
To see if breakfast was Boggs' last meal, investigators turned to scientists at the University of Colorado.
We've done the same thing with woolly mammoths frozen in the ice in Siberia and Alaska, identified what plants they were eating.
David Norris, an endocrinologist at the University of Colorado, and his colleague, forensic botanist Jane Buck, were asked to examine Boggs' stomach contents. Basically, humans consume between 50 and 75 different types of plants in their diet. Plants are easier to distinguish in the stomach than animal products.
The cell walls themselves remain intact, and they'll pass entirely through the digestive system. This makes identification quite easy. It doesn't make any difference whether the material was frozen, whether it was boiled. It will remain virtually indestructible.
Dr. Norris placed a sample of Boggs' stomach contents on a slide. Under his microscope, Dr. Norris saw a jumble of irregular hexagons. He recognized them as the intact cells of either potato or apple. Both have nearly identical cell structures. To determine which one, Dr. Norris used potassium iodide, a test for the presence of starch.
A drop of it is added to the material on the slide, and if starch is present, it will turn black.
Under a microscope, the cells turn black, which confirmed the presence of starch. The cells were from potatoes. Since Jerry ate hash browns on the day he was murdered, the presence of potatoes seemed to indicate breakfast was his last meal. Or was it?
In addition to the potato cells, I also saw cells of onions. And these are relatively easy to identify because of the brick-like shape of the cells and the way they're put together, kind of like looking at a brick wall.
The short-order cook at the diner insisted he never put onions in the eggs or the hash brown potatoes.
So we thought, well, this is a worry. Maybe he did have another later meal.
Another meal meant that Boggs was killed after dinner. The prime suspect, his ex-wife Jill Coit, had an airtight alibi for that night. The only other suspects were the two men seen near Boggs' home, whom police hadn't yet identified. The mysterious murder of Jerry Boggs baffled police in the quiet resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Investigators found evidence that Boggs grew suspicious of his ex-wife after the annulment, when he caught her lying about her date of birth. Boggs hired his friend, Judy Pryor Lewis, a private investigator, to look into Jill's background. And what she uncovered was shocking. She learned that Jill lied about her pregnancy with Jerry's baby. She hadn't been pregnant at all. She had a hysterectomy years earlier.
She claimed to have a child, and we were all telling him there is no child. It's all just a ruse. He still believed it. He just couldn't accept it. He would come down to our house, and I would just try everything I knew to convince him that there really was no baby.
Jill was a former model and beauty queen who had lied to Jerry about her background and the number of times she was married. Jill Lunita Billiot, Einan Moore Coit Brody, DeRosa Metzger Steely Boggs Carroll had been married nearly a dozen times.
I don't smoke or drink. I guess my greatest sin is that I get married.
Jill had married and divorced another man after Jerry, and was about to walk down the aisle yet again to her new boyfriend, Michael Backus. And what was Boggs' reaction?
He started laughing. We just sat and laughed. He's like, oh my God.
What wasn't so funny was Jill's third husband, William Coit, had been murdered 20 years earlier with the same caliber weapon that killed Jerry Boggs. William Coit's murder was unsolved.
The circumstances were very similar in that both Jerry Boggs and William Coit were preparing to take her to court. They were within a week of a court date. They were within a week of a court date where her character was going to be exposed.
And Boggs' private investigator found evidence that Jill falsely claimed to be pregnant in other marriages, presumably for financial purposes.
Mr. Boggs, I think, was at the point of disclosing to the world many things about Jill Coit that she wanted to remain secret. And she had taken, I think, a very dramatic step to ensure that that did not occur.
She'd gotten away with so many things, and she was proud of it. That she's been married, 10 or 11 times, 6 bigamies out of that. All these kids she says that she's had, she hasn't, and she couldn't stand it.
Jill said she was camping in a state park on the night of Boggs' murder. But in order to completely eliminate her as a suspect, investigators needed to be sure Boggs was killed at night and not earlier in the day. Boggs' murder presumably happened at night after dinner, since onions were discovered in his stomach. The cooks at the shack insisted they didn't put onions in Boggs' breakfast on the morning of his death. One of Steamboat's homicide investigators decided to take a closer look.
Not to be deterred, he took himself down there and stood in the kitchen and watched them making breakfast one morning.
The cook prepared the same breakfast Jerry Boggs always ate. True to his word, the cook did not add onions to the hash browns he threw on the grill. But while watching the grill, homicide investigators saw a flurry of activity that suddenly explained everything. Every time the cook turned an omelet or scattered an order of hash browns, small portions of diced onions from other orders would get mixed in.
I believe he photographed the spatula that was used to flip the eggs, to grill the hash brown potatoes, and the edge of the spatula is covered with bits of onion.
You don't know when you're getting the food at the other end what's going on the grill.
Breakfast had, in fact, been Jerry Boggs' last meal.
We felt vindicated, we felt very good about that because we knew they were there.
Boggs was killed just a few hours after breakfast. Jill Coit did not have an alibi for the afternoon of Boggs' death. Still, the stomach contents yielded only circumstantial evidence.
We didn't have any direct evidence. We didn't have any fingerprints, any DNA, anything that directly connected anyone to the crime scene. We didn't have anything in the nature of a confession in connection with the case. We didn't have smoking gun type of evidence.
Armed with a search warrant, police searched Jill's car and found wigs, maps of Mexico, and a stun gun. Was it possible it was Jill Coit in disguise that the neighbors saw walking in the vicinity of Jerry's home on the afternoon of his murder? The weapon used in Jerry Boggs' murder, a .25 caliber pistol, was not found in Jill Coit's car. But investigators suspected the stun gun in her trunk may have caused the unusual marks on Boggs' face and neck, which were noted during the autopsy.
Stun gun injuries fall into a category of injuries called patterned injuries, which means the injuries mirror the object that caused them. So in the case of a stun gun injury, you will have electrical burns mimic the distance between the electrodes that caused them. The injuries lined up identically with the distance between the electrodes.
Pig skin most closely resembles human skin. So Dr. Doberson applied the stun gun to a live anesthetized pig to see if he could reproduce the round, reddish marks on Jerry Boggs' neck and face. The marks were similar.
Interestingly enough, the animal has to be alive in order to show the characteristic injuries, which also means that Jerry Boggs was alive at the time that he sustained those injuries.
The forensic evidence was bringing the crime into focus. The witness who reported seeing two men near Jerry's home on the day of the murder said Jill Coit and her boyfriend Michael Backus resembled the men in height.
Jill liked to wear disguises and had a number of disguises. And eventually we even came up with a photograph that had been taken of her sometime prior to the homicide, where she was wearing a beard and a mustache.
And Jill's alibi disintegrated when police could find no evidence that she had signed in and paid the admission fee to Poudre National Park on the day of the murder. Jill Coit and Michael Backus were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the preliminary hearing, it appeared even Jill was impressed with the forensic evidence against her.
I remember presenting all of that in front of the judge, and she was there. At the end, I picked up all my materials and slides and walked out next to her, and she looked at me and said, "Nice job." And then I took that as quite a compliment.
And there was a surprise witness. Jill's son, Seth, testified against her.
Right after she and Backus had committed the murder, she telephoned Seth to let him know. I believe her words to him were something to the effect of, "It's over, and it was messy."
It did not appear to me that he really had participated in any meaningful way, that he had been a conspirator in connection with that. It appeared to me that he had been very little more than an unwilling person being provided information by somebody who was trying to get him to engage in activity.
Prosecutors believe that Michael Backus and Jill Coit, in disguise, entered Jerry's home in the early afternoon with the intent of murdering Boggs, presumably to end their financial dispute. After having his usual breakfast of eggs, toast, and hash browns, which had been unknowingly spiked with onions, Boggs left work early that day and arrived home sometime after 1 p.m. When he did, Jill and her boyfriend were waiting. Boggs was ambushed at the back door, first with a stun gun, then with the shovel. After a suffocation attempt failed, prosecutors believe it was Jill who shot Boggs 3 times with a .25 caliber pistol. The two were careful not to leave incriminating evidence, and their disguises were almost foolproof. But they never realized forensic science could identify the specific items in Boggs' stomach which destroyed their flimsy alibi. When news of the crime became public, Jill's oldest son, William, came forward with his suspicions that his mother had also killed his father, William Coit Sr., some 20 years earlier.
She's more like a praying mantis. She just devours them once she gets a hold of them.
It took the jury only 5 hours to find Jill Coit and Michael Backus guilty of first-degree murder.
I think she was more or less motivated on the money. I think she thought that would make her happy in life. And look where she is. So apparently money can't buy you everything, huh?
They were both sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole.
I believe that Jill Coit was aware that there are methods for determining time of death. I don't think she was aware that the stomach contents could be that telling.
It ultimately blew her alibi out of the water.
I think she was pretty clever. They were pretty clever in wearing, you know, bringing along clothing or plastic bags or whatever they used to camouflage themselves from leaving forensic evidence. I mean, they There were no prints, no hairs, nothing. And so they were very cautious about that, but she should have been watching some of your shows.